Charleston celebrates its 350th anniversary this year, and to commemorate that, Charleston Pirate Tours brings you Charleston History Highlights. Hi, Eric of Charleston Pirate Tours. I'm down here on Sullivan's Island, crashing surf behind me. What better place and location to tell one of my favorite stories? Now, I don't know too many people out there who actually are happy if they encounter a ghost. I mean, most people, you would think, would go through their lives and try to avoid such an encounter. However, there is one ghost that, quite honestly, a lot of people are really glad they met him. And that was the Gray Man of Pawleys Island. Now, who is the Gray Man of Pawleys Island? I've heard so many variations of this story, it's really hard to keep up. I've heard people call him a Civil War soldier who died on his way to the island to meet his fiancée after the war and was killed as he was heading back home. I've also heard his name was probably Percival Pawley, the man Pawleys Island is named after. And then there's also Mr. Weston, who was the guy who built the Pelican Inn. All of these people have been at some point given credit to being the ghost called the Gray Man. But there's one thing about the Gray Man: for over 200 years, he's been known to appear to people along the island when there are major storms approaching. And there's been many accounts of people's encounters with him. I'll share a couple of them with you. One of my favorites was in 1954, there was a couple who was here on their honeymoon up at Pawleys Island. Now, just for reference, where we're standing, Pawleys Island is probably about 45 miles north of here. So you've got this couple on their honeymoon. They're in their little honeymoon boudoir, if you will. And there was a knock on the door. And they answered the door, and there was a man, they said, in all wrinkled up clothes, gray from head to foot, in a shirt and pants. And he said he was sent by the Red Cross to tell them they needed to vacate the property because there was a storm coming. So they promptly left. And that is when Hurricane Hazel came ashore and devastated that part of the coastline and wiping out that property where they were staying. But there's probably not a better good example of how people have encountered the ghost of the Gray Man until 1989. Of course, that was when Hurricane Hugo made landfall here in South Carolina. Now, I've grown up in South Carolina, and I remember well when Hurricane Hugo came roaring ashore right at the stroke of midnight between the 21st and 22nd of September in 1989. And it devastated the coast. And because of the how media was in 1989, newspaper was really your best reference. This was well before people had the internet. So I used to collect old newspapers, and I collected quite a few of them after Hurricane Hugo. And there were a lot of great references to things that happened in the newspapers. And I thought I'd share my favorite one with you. It's came out of a newspaper, a local writer who was coming down out of the Florence area, heading down to the coast, talking about the devastation he was coming across and stopping and interviewing people. And when he came to the Macedonia community, which is a little northwest of here, he met a young lady who was happy to talk to him. And I thought I'd share it with you. I just pulled this out of that newspaper and printed it out so I didn't drag an old newspaper down to the beach. She was talking about what happened around their house during Hurricane Hugo. She said that my son raises chickens. You know, them fighting chickens. Well, anyways, during the storm, he went out and tied them down so they wouldn't get blowed away. And it worked mostly, but none of them chickens had a feather on them the next morning. Well, Hurricane Hugo did roar ashore, but not before the Gray Man made an appearance. The Moore family of Pawleys Island had retired up there, built their dream home along the beach, were out walking a few days before the storm came ashore. And there, walking among the dunes, they came across the Gray Man. There was no words exchanged. He just passed them and gave them a polite nod, and then he vanished. Well, knowing the story, they went home and packed up a few things and left the island. Of course, we know that Polly's Island took a heavy, heavy hit during that storm. And when they came back to their house, they were quite surprised at what they came across. The neighborhood was devastated. Neighbors' houses completely wiped out. But there stood their house right where they left it. It looked like they had just run to the store. They walked up the steps, unlocked the door, and walked right in. As they're walking through the house, they noticed the back door that faced out toward the ocean had blown open, and there was some water in the floor. So they managed to get that up with a towel. Walking onto the back deck, the one thing that really surprised them the most, the day they came off of the beach before vacating the island, they had grabbed a couple of beach towels and had wiped off their legs to knock off the sand and dry their legs from walking in the surf, and had taken them and they had hanged them over the back of the rail, along the railing around their patio there. And when they came back home, despite the fact that the winds howled 140 miles an hour up there on that beach, all of their patio furniture was in place, and those beach towels were still hanging on a perfectly fine deck on the back of their house that sustained no damage. Does the gray man live or die, exist, whatever ghosts do? I tend to think he does. And I, for one, would be very happy living out on the Isle of Palms to be able to run across him knowing a storm was bearing down. Happy birthday, Charleston.